Welcome to the latest edition of HCTV. The last 18 months has seen great volatility in the commercial and rental tenants. Rent is a fixed cost and one of the major costs of many SMEs, and it's pretty much inescapable, regardless of whether you're actually trading your business as a result of the most recent COVID lockdowns. With the lockdown in Sydney and New South Wales becoming more protracted, the New South Wales government announced over the weekend some welcome relief for commercial and retail tenants. Joining me today to unpack these changes is tenants advocate and lease negotiator John Christopoulos of RCI Advisory. Welcome, John.
Good to be with you, Blair.
I suppose as a starting point, could you recap the measures in place for rental relief, which were in response to the initial round of COVID lockdowns last year?
Yeah, well, what happened was last year that the federal government introduced the National Mandatory Code of Conduct for commercial tenancies. Now, that was enacted at individual state levels. There were some minor changes between that, but the commonality was in line with JobKeeper. So those protections ended with the end of JobKeeper at the end of March. So that's seen a couple of things. That's seen the period April, May and June being reverting back to normal rent. Reverting back to normal rent, as well as the repayment of any deferred rent from last year. Now, with recent lockdowns, particularly New South Wales and Victoria, we've seen since the 23rd of June, a lockdown, and we're approaching at the moment in New South Wales, our 8th week of lockdown. So to cover the current lockdown, the New South Wales government introduced an extension to their retail and other commercial leases legislation, which basically only prohibited lockouts or prescribed action, such as taking possession of premises. Now, in effect, where that left businesses up to last week was that they had no mandatory rental protection like they did last year. They were only protected from being locked out. So what we did see at the end of last week was the government expand that legislation to bring it in line with last year. So that mandates a rental reduction in line with the reduction in a business's turnover. So in effect, that was a mix of waivers and deferrals. So it was to give businesses that temporary relief, but also help them with their cash flows. One of the most significant parts in that widening and extension of that legislation was the government introduced in New South Wales a $40 million small landlord relief fund. So small landlords can qualify for a payment of up to $3,000 a month if they pass on the appropriate equal rental reductions to their tenants. So that was one thing. And the other thing that was extended and changed since the last legislation ended in March was the eligibility for that rental protection expanded from being under $5 million to under $50 million. So particularly when you're talking about a business that's got multiple outlets, that now is covered for protection. So from the period of 23rd of June onwards, at least to the end of August and beyond, these businesses are protected. The legislation is in place to January 2022.
So, well, I suppose as we know, the lockdowns aren't confined to Sydney and New South Wales. What measures have been introduced by other state governments across the eastern seaboard?
Okay, in terms of Victoria, they've also got a scheme in place. So it's what they call the new commercial tenancy relief scheme, which similarly to New South Wales provides relief in line with the reduction in a business's turnover. Now they're basing that in New South Wales, the comparative turnover is from the same period in 2019, whereas in Victoria, the turnover qualification is the first quarter of 2018 and 19. So they've got a similar system in place. They've also got that initial rent relief as well as relief for landlords with their land tax as well. Victoria is one, Blair, that still hasn't finalised the total relief package. So there's still a little bit more to come in terms of making that all official. but it's in line with New South Wales. Queensland's a little bit different, and it's been one of the only of the 3 states that's been least affected by lockdowns across the East Coast. So as it stands today, there is no legislative framework in place which requires landlords to reduce rent. There is still, however, the reasonable recovery period, which was on last year's National Mandatory Code of Conduct, which basically allowed for a recovery period. Now, when you're talking businesses that are in tourism, hospitality, particularly in affected areas, these are technically still covered by that reasonable recovery period. But the onus really is on the individual landlord and tenant to get to the table and talk about each individual situation. And I'll use as an example, if you're a shopping centre operator, well, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. The supermarket different to the flight centre or the travel agent, or other businesses that might be mandated to close. So Queensland's a little bit less in terms of legislative framework, but the commonality between the 3 states is that negotiation is key.
Just on the, I guess, on the mandatory code of conduct from last year, and I guess anecdotally, I'd heard of instances of landlords, in particular overseas-based landlords, not really engaging in the negotiation side of the negotiation that's provided for in the mandatory code of conduct. Is there any relief for a tenant affected by that situation?
There is still the mandated reduction in rent. So whether or not your landlord wants to pass that on, they are obliged to. So when it then gets to mediation or it gets to NCAT, okay, there is that bottom line that's required in so much that you qualify. So in New South Wales, you have to qualify for the business grant, the micro business grant, or the Job Saver program. So you need to be a 30%, demonstrate a 30% decrease in your revenue, okay, and you need to have qualified and be eligible for those programs. So that is your fallback position. So even if your landlord doesn't want or doesn't engage in negotiation, you have to put forward a case for rent reduction, and they are required to follow up or engage in negotiations within a 14-day period, okay? If they don't engage in those constructive negotiations with 14 days, you then lodge for a mediation for your relative state-based. In New South Wales, it's your Small Business Commissioner, and in Victoria, your VSBC as well.
So what would your advice be to an SME struggling under a rental burden at the moment?
I think the first and foremost is don't put your head in the sand. I think you need to know that in particularly Victoria and New South Wales, there are legislative measures in place, okay? There are legislative measures in place which are designed to help you. But those measures are only as good as the level of transparency, negotiation, and cooperation. So I see the basis of any discussion or any matter moving forward is that you need to take a collaborative, transparent, and cooperative negotiation process. So you need to open a line of communication with your landlord. You need to tell them where you're at. You can't put your head in the sand and refuse to pay any rent. You need to remember, despite you being closed, you still are obliged to pay at least your outgoings and the percentage of rent. Don't let it accrue. Don't let it build up. You're only digging yourself a bigger hole. So open the line of communication, start talking to your landlord. And one of the things, Blair, is that I think that the typical landlord-tenant relationship has changed considerably over COVID. So good landlords at the end of the day aren't going to want to lose good tenants, okay? And there's lots of good tenants and good SMEs out there for no fault of their own, either by their geographic location or the industry that they're in, are faced with difficult circumstances. But that's not to say that the sun won't come out and shine again. Good landlords will want to keep good tenants, and all of this legislation and protections are in place are based on good faith and transparent negotiations.
So just one final question, I guess. If you were given a crystal ball, what would you envisage in the medium-term outlook for landlords and tenants in, say, the post-lockdown vaccinated future?
Yeah, I think that you need to take a piece-by-piece approach. I think that the recovery period is going to be key, and there needs to be some clarity with regards to industry-specific support and handling of that recovery period. As we know, tourism is going to suffer, and it's going to suffer for some time. Education, and I'm dealing with matters in the universities and educational facilities, which are also going to take some time for overseas students to come back. But there's other industries that will come back a lot quicker. I think it's going to be a 18-month process. I think it's going to creep possibly into 2023, and it needs to be taken on a case-by-case industry perspective and as a block. This isn't a recovery period is not going to automatically start when the lockdowns end. It's going to take time, and it needs to be dealt with on a quarterly by quarterly basis. So in looking into the crystal ball, I think we're definitely into 2022, potentially into 2023, and we need to take a recovery approach, and we need to take a step-by-step moving back towards some sort of normality into 2023. How quickly that is, it goes depending on individual industries and individual geographical areas as well.
So for tenants, if a tenant or indeed a landlord is looking for some advice from yourself, how can they get a hold of you?
They can contact me at john@rci, R for Richard, C for Charlie, I for India, advisory, all one word, .com.au, or give me a call on my mobile, 0414 46 9139. Now, there's lots of people that are in a lot of distress and are intimidated to speak out. Run to a lawyer. Anyone can contact me at any time for an obligation and free discussion as to their situation to get some clarity as to where they're at. It's a very, very difficult situation. There's a lot of angst, there's a lot of distress out there, but the bottom line and the message I think needs to go to all SMEs is that there is help out there, there are protections out there, and there is a way out of this.
Well, thanks very much, John. As we know, it is very much an evolving issue, and no doubt we'll be speaking again. That's it for this edition. That's it for this edition of HCTV, and see you next time.